Committee will come to order pursuant to notice. We meet today to mark up 9 bipartisan measures. Without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit statements or extraneous material on today's business. As members were notified yesterday, we intend to consider today's measures en bloc, and so without objection, the following items previously provided to members and also in your packets will be considered en bloc, and they are considered as read. House Resolution 256. This is expressing support for the countries of Eastern Europe and for NATO. The Royce Amendment in the nature of a substitute, Royce Amendment 134 and Wilson Amendments 68. House Resolution 944, expressing sympathy for the people of Guatemala after the recent volcano eruption, with a Taurus Amendment 11 in the nature of a substitute. H.R. 1697, the Israel Anti-Boycott Act, the Royce Amendment in the nature of a substitute, DeSantis Amendment 82, and Royce Amendment 1. H.R. 4969, the Improving Embassy Design and Security Act of 2018, McCall Amendment 105 in the nature of substitute, and Titus Amendment 62. H.R. 5576, the Cyber Deterrence and Response Act, with the Yoho Amendment 137 in the nature of a substitute, Connolly Amendment 86, Royce Amendment 2. H.R. 5898, the UN Relief and Works Agency Accountability Act, with the Zeldin Amendment in the nature of a substitute, Cicilline Amendment number 1, Perry Amendment number 1. H.R. 6197, the Rescuing Animals and Rewards Act, and H.R. 6207, the Democratic Republic of the Congo Democracy and Accountability Act, with the Royce Amendment 133. And House Concurrent Resolution 20 regarding the execution-style murders of U.S. citizens in the Republic of Serbia in July of 1999. I now recognize myself to speak on today's business, and I will just explain that first we're going to have H.R. 6207. This would be the Democratic Republic of the Congo Democracy and Accountability Act. And as an original co-sponsor of this bill, I want to thank many of the members of this committee who have traveled with me to the Congo. I've made 3 trips there now in order to try to push for elections. I deeply appreciate the bipartisan work of Chairman Smith and Ranking Member Bass at the Africa Subcommittee. President Kabila's security forces are responsible, as we know on this committee, for massive human rights abuses and great instability across the DRC. This bill will help push Kabila to follow through with his commitments to do one thing that we've all pushed him on: to hold free, fair, and transparent elections in December of this year, as Congo is committed to do. Next, we have H.R. 1697. This is the Israel Anti-Boycott Act. This bill was sponsored by Representative Roscom and Vargas. It prohibits U.S. companies from participating in boycotts promoted by international organizations like the UN that target U.S. partners like Israel. Next, we have H.R. 5898. This is the United Nations Relief and Works Agency Accountability Act. And I want to thank the authors, Representatives Cicilline and Representative Zeldin, for this bipartisan bill to strengthen congressional oversight of the State Department and this agency. Next, we consider H.R. 4969. This is the Improving Embassy Design and Security Act, and this legislation will improve the security, the functionality, the efficiency of our embassies overseas. And I want to thank the bill's sponsors, that would be Chairman McCall and Rep. Kelly, as well as Ranking Member Engel, for their work on this legislation, because by strengthening oversight and management of construction of new facilities, we can better protect our diplomats, and we'll save taxpayer dollars too by the way this legislation was crafted. Next, we have H.R. 5576. This is the Cyber Deterrence and Response Act. Malicious cyber activity by foreign governments including especially Russia, China, North Korea, cannot be tolerated. So Chairman Yoho's bill before us today builds on this committee's previous work by establishing a framework for deterring and responding to malicious state-sponsored cyber activity. Next, we have H.R. 6197, the Rescuing Animals with Rewards Act. This builds on the committee's conservation work by prioritizing efforts to counter transnational wildlife traffickers through the State Department's existing rewards program. These tools were successfully used, if you'll recall, in 2014 to bring the Laotian trafficker known as the Pablo Escobar of wildlife crime to justice. I want to thank the bill's author, that be Representative Dan Donovan, former prosecutor, for this measure. Next, we have House Resolution 944. Hundreds of Guatemalans perished in the eruption of the volcano in June. Thousands have been displaced. I wanted to thank Congresswoman Torres for this timely resolution, to extend our condolences to the people of Guatemala, and to recognize the State Department and USAID's swift response to this crisis. Next, we have House Resolution 256, which sends a strong message of support to our allies in Central and Eastern Europe that are under increasing pressure by Russia. We thank Steve Cohen for this measure. Finally, we have House Concurrent Resolution 20. In July 1999, after the Kosovo War was ended, there were 3 young American brothers that were there and were illegally arrested while they were traveling through Serbia. Despite a court order for their release, all 3 brothers were instead taken by a Serbian Special Operations Unit. They were murdered execution style, and they were left atop a mass grave. I would like to take a moment to express our deep condolences to the Bitucci family, because that family is with us today. This marks 20 years since these U.S. citizens were assassinated. Yet to date, no one has been brought to justice for their deaths. And I want to thank Representative Zeldin for this measure, but we again want to deeply extend our condolences to the family here with us today. We are very, very sorry for your loss. So I will now recognize the ranking member for his remarks. Mr. Engel.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for calling this markup. I have a lengthy statement addressing all the good measures before us today, and I ask unanimous consent that it be included in its entirety as part of the record.
Without objection.
I know we're short on time this morning. Final votes will be called soon, and I want to give members an opportunity to speak about their bills and resolutions. I just want to speak about one bill briefly, and that's the bill you just mentioned about the Bitici brothers. I have spent extensive time of my years in Congress fighting for the independence of Kosovo, and these brothers, American citizens, were murdered by Serb forces. Despite many of us having contacts with Serbia, I appealed to the Serbian strongman, Mr. Vucic, when he was here and came to my office twice and promised me that this would be resolved within a month. More than a year, of course, it hasn't been resolved, and it's an absolute disgrace. And so we have to keep supporting the Albanian people in their struggle in Kosovo, and keep the presence of the Bitici brothers alive, and we're not going to stop till we get justice for them. So I want to single out that resolution. Again, I support all the resolutions. I'm grateful, as usual, to our members on both sides of the aisle for their hard work, and I thank you again, Mr. Chairman. I wish everyone a safe and happy Independence Day, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Engel. We go to Eliana Ross-Leitonen.
Thank you so much, Chairman Royce, and I applaud your efforts as well as Ranking Member Engel to continue to bring forth bipartisan measures before this committee for consideration. I wanted to speak on the UNRWA Accountability Act offered by our friends and colleagues, Mr. Cicilline and Mr. Zeldin. I applaud their efforts to find a way forward in ensuring that we hold UNRWA accountable and that no U.S. taxpayer dollars are being misused against our interest. We can all support the idea that greater transparency, oversight, and accountability are needed at all UN agencies, not just UNRWA. However, I worry that this bill, which requires a report from the administration on its UNRWA strategy, doesn't quite go far enough. The United States holds considerable leverage when it comes to UNRWA, namely that it relies on the kindness of our contributions. We shouldn't wait to use that leverage. This bill should lay out the conditions we need to see reform at UNRWA before the U.S. will allocate more money to that agency. It's an ever-expanding mandate, an ever-expanding budget gap, an ever-growing politicization at the agency, and all of that makes it difficult for us to continue supporting this agency without seeing concrete reform and action to address our concerns, not to mention the idea of having a definition of the word refugee that guarantees it, Mr. Chairman, that the number of Palestinians that UNRWA mandate covers will expand. So the model is untenable, it's unjustifiable, especially when there's an entire entity at the UN that is already supposed to be its refugee agency, a body which, by the way, covers 12 times more individuals than UNRWA, yet somehow employs less than a third of the people than UNRWA. And a body that has its own definition of a refugee that doesn't match with the UN's own refugee agency, nor does it match how we would define an agency, a refugee. So while, again, I applaud my colleagues' effort and I support this measure, I would have liked to have seen us do more to condition our assistance to UNRWA until we see real reforms. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Good points, Congresswoman. We go now to Brad Sherman of California.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for this markup, bringing excellent bills to our attention. I support them all. I think I've co-sponsored virtually all of them. As to the Anti-Israel Boycott Act, this has drawn a lot of attention. I'm pleased to be the lead Democrat on this bill. We have for decades said that Americans will not be forced to boycott a friend of the United States by international economic pressure, that the effort of Saudi Arabia and others to tell American companies, you must not do business with Israel or you will be deprived of economic opportunities, we've responded to that by saying no American company can furnish the Saudi Arabian government with proof that it is boycotting Israel or in otherwise cooperate with the Saudis on this. What this bill does is it says there's no loophole in this long-standing, multi-decade policy if the pressure comes not from one government but from an association of foreign governments. Let me make it clear, nothing in this bill says that you cannot any domestic organization can't protest against Israel or boycott its products or those of any other ally of the United States. It simply says that we will not allow American citizens to be pressured into that by foreign governments, which has long been our law, or by associations of foreign governments. I should also comment on the Cyber Deterrence and Response Act. Pleased to join with Chairman Yoho of the Asia Subcommittee, of which I'm the ranking member, because this is not just a Russia problem. But I'm pleased that this bill does focus on the way that states, including Russia, have sought to undermine our electoral system. And that is a bipartisan issue, not just an issue of one party. No American wants to see Russia influencing our elections, particularly through illegal and hidden measures. I want to, of course, support the Congo Democracy and Accountability Act And I want to commend Representative Smith and Bass, and of course the chair and ranking member for their work on this bill, reaffirming our commitment to peace and stability in the region, especially in light of President Kabila's obstruction of elections. The other bills before us are also excellent, and in support of them, I will yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Sherman. Mr. Chris Smith of New Jersey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And just let me say very briefly, I support the bills that are before us, but I just would like to focus especially on the Democratic Republic of Congo Democracy and Accountability Act, H.R. 6207. I, too, have been to the DRC, both to the capital and to Goma. We all know that the DRC and the people of that country have suffered so enormously over the years. More than 5.4 million people died between 97 and 03. Peacekeepers that were deployed there, the largest UN peacekeeping force in the world, were found complicit in human trafficking, especially the rape of young children. Thankfully, that has been largely stopped. I held 4 hearings on that, went there to investigate that in Goma, and was shocked and dismayed by that kind of, when the peacekeepers are part of the problem and working and doing things that rogue elements are doing, you know we have a serious problem. This legislation focuses especially on Kabila and his unwillingness to step aside and to allow the election to occur in a timely fashion. We have called, and the Obama administration did impose sanctions on key figures. Those are codified in this legislation. And our our ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, has been very forthright as well in speaking out against Kabila's clinching of power and unwillingness to let go of it. H.R. 6207 supports the humanitarian efforts that are being made by civil society. And in the ongoing effort, Ms. Bass and I have held a number of hearings on the DR Congo, most recently on May 9th, another one late last year, of which you were a part of that, Mr. Chairman. But, John Pendergast summed it up. The Kabila government's track record of violent repression against civil society, pro-democracy movements, and faith-based groups raises concerns that these new protests will be met with a fresh wave of violent repression, and we speak to that in the body of the language of the bill as well. People want a free and fair and transparent election in the DR Congo. The Catholic Church has played a huge role in trying to ensure that. The Sylvester Agreement in 2016 was a great effort to bring things together, and of course, it has been largely frustrated by Joseph Kabila, and this legislation tries to take it to the next step and get the administration here and there further engaged to get this right. So I thank you for marking this piece of legislation up and yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Smith, and thank you for all your work on that issue as well. Congresswoman Karen Bass of California.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Ranking Member Engel, for bringing up H.R. 6207 to the committee today for consideration. H.R. 6207, the DRC Democracy and Accountability Act, seeks to promote free and fair elections in the DRC by imposing sanctions on high-level individuals who are undermining democratic processes and institutions in the country, as well as those who are responsible for extrajudicial killings and have engaged in public corruption. With respect to the ongoing political situation in the DRC, President Kabila has deliberately stalled planned elections despite completing his constitutionally mandated 2 terms. I personally am very concerned that although he has committed to having elections in December, there's not a lot of faith that that's actually going to happen. And I can't think of any issue more than the DRC that I have had numerous constituents who are in the diaspora who have come in and really called on us to please help the situation. So last year, the UN General Secretary Kofi Annan and 9 former African presidents said, Congo's future is in grave danger. We are deeply concerned about the political situation in the DRC, which represents a threat to the stability, prosperity, and peace of the Great Lakes region and indeed for Africa as a whole. We feel obliged to sound the alarm before it's too late. 9 former African presidents have said that. I'm proud that my colleagues Chris Smith, Chairman Royce, and Ranking Member Elliott Engel and I are able to answer this call and put forth legislation that seeks to address the situation in the DRC. Thank you, and I yield back.
Well, thank you, Congresswoman, and it is certainly true that heads of state across Africa, we just had a delegation out there, and everyone's focused on the same issue. As a matter of fact, in the international community, everyone's focused on the same issue, the importance, come December, of having those elections across Congo. Joe Wilson, South Carolina.
Thank you, Chairman Ed Royce, and thank you, Ranking Member Elliott Engel. I particularly want to commend Congressman Engel on his renomination this week. We're really grateful for his continued service on behalf of the American people. And thank you for convening this markup of legislation that embodies the committee's emphasis on building national and international security, improving human rights, and fighting international crime. I'm also grateful for Congressman Steve Cohen for introducing House Resolution 256, expressing support for the countries of Central and Eastern Europe and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. As the grateful co-chairman of the Bulgaria Caucus, I appreciate Bulgarian Prime Minister Boyko Borisov and Bulgarian Ambassador to the United States, Timur Stoichev, for their strong support of NATO. As the NATO summit in July approaches, it's important for Congress of the United States to affirm its commitment to the alliance, and particularly Article 5, which states that an arm attack on one shall be considered an arm attack on all. This commitment from the whole of NATO ensures security among our Eastern and Central European NATO allies. Article 5's commitment to defend members is critical with the Russian invasion of eastern Ukraine and illegal occupation of Crimea since 2014, and earlier aggression in Moldova and the Republic of Georgia. Thankfully, President Trump has rightfully promoted the fundamental concept of collective defense in his historic Warsaw Address. The security of NATO provides the United States and Europe has never been more critical as we promote the European Deterrence Initiative with NATO troops deployed in Poland, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania. This morning I met with the Polish Secretary of State Plenipotentiary of the Prime Minister, Anna Maria Anders, who promoted a permanent American NATO basing in Poland to support peace through strength. I also appreciate House Resolution 944 expressing solidarity and sympathy of the people of Guatemala after the June 3rd, 2018 eruption of the Fuego volcano. I'm grateful for Congresswoman Norma Torres for introducing this legislation and highlighting the ongoing plight of the Guatemalan people to combat the destruction by the volcanic eruption. Last August, I saw firsthand the talented people of Guatemala with former Ambassador Tony Hall serving with the Food for the Hungry program, and was welcomed by Ambassador Manuel Alfredo Espina and the courageous President Jimmy Morales. This legislation for markup and discussion today provides and strengthens America's national and international security, protects Americans abroad, and promotes American values among our friends and allies. I'm grateful to support and co-sponsor all of today's markup legislation, and I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. We go to Lois Frankel of Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our ranking member, to all the members whose bills are on deck today, and I support them all. I want to highlight a couple of them. First, the Israeli Anti-Boycott Act, which I'm a co-sponsor, which would expand anti-boycott laws prohibiting United States compliance with the Arab League boycott of Israel to international organizations, so that American companies doing business with Israel are protected from the efforts to target them. And I want to thank my colleagues for making changes to the bill that would ensure protection of First Amendment rights. The boycott divestment sanctions, or BDS movement, encourages economic warfare against Israel, our strongest ally in the Middle East. And demonizing Israel harms the world's only Jewish state, but it also creates a roadblock on the path to peace, impacting both Israelis and Palestinians. For example, I'm going to give an example of this. After facing mounting boycotts, SodaStream, an Israeli soda machine company, was forced to shut down a West Bank factory putting 600 Palestinians out of work. Ali Jafar, a shift manager, said, quote, all the people who wanted to close it are mistaken. They didn't take into consideration the families. Second, I want to draw attention to the UNRWA Accountability Act. The Trump administration has frozen all assistance to the West Bank and Gaza, including the United Nations Relief and Work Agency, pending a review and providing no timeline or specifics to Congress. This bipartisan bill would increase transparency and congressional oversight, forcing the administration to report on the ongoing review. Because the freeze makes no sense, because if you want to stop the further violence from spilling over even further, we have to participate in humanitarian assistance. The senior Israeli security officials have warned that if the situation in Gaza continues to deteriorate, it could lead to war. And the last bill I'd like to mention is a Resolution 256, which expresses support for NATO and the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, condemns Russia's Ukraine occupation, and calls for U.S. continued support for allied countries in Central and Eastern Europe. Over the past 4 years, I've been privileged with some of the members here to represent the United States at the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. And in this role, I'm frequently reminded that no man or woman is an island. Societies do not thrive when they are isolated from others. And we need our allies to stand with us as we fight for mutually shared democratic values. It was reported this morning that Mr. Trump told the leaders at a recent G7 summit that NATO is as bad as NAFTA, that's much too costly for the United States. And this president likes to call NATO obsolete. And I just want to say, I think he's flat wrong. It is so relevant today, given the dynamics of threats we and our allies face. At a time when the administration sows doubts about this critical alliance, we must affirm our commitment to NATO and reassure our Central and Eastern Europe partners that we will defend them against Russian aggression. And I yield back. And again, thank my colleagues.
I thank the gentlelady. We go to Ted Yoho of Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I get started, I'd just like to acknowledge the Bertucci family again and for the sacrifice that you guys have made and your family members. Our hearts go out to you. Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Engel, I want to briefly address the Cyber Deterrence Response Act. Most importantly, I want to thank you and other original co-sponsors for supporting the bill and working so closely with our team to create a carefully tailored and bipartisan piece of legislation. Without objection, I'd like to submit up for the record this letter of support from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. As the Chamber points out, the bill will help spotlight adherence to international norms and deterrence to heighten the cost on countries or their subordinates that hack the United States.
Without objection.
It's no secret the United States urgently needs to upgrade its cyber deterrence, but there are no procedures in current law for naming and shaming state sponsors, hackers, and/or linking penalties to their illicit conduct. We have spent over a year working to make sure this legislation is consistent with past practices and doesn't tie the hands of the executive branch, but will still upgrade our cyber deterrence measures by establishing minimum penalties and ensuring the cyber actions are implemented consistently across administrations to come. The Cyber Deterrence Response Act also pairs very well with Chairman Royce's Cyber Diplomacy Act, which will elevate cyber issues in the State Department. Together, these pieces of legislation begin to lay out a much-needed national cyber policy, and it's a proactive component to establish norms and a reactive component to defend our interests. I thank you and hope my colleagues on the committee will give their support of the bill, and I yield back.
Thank you. We go to Robin Kelly of Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for including H.R. 4969 in today's markup, the Improving Embassy Design and Security Act. Together with Mr. McCall, I'm proud to support this important legislation that will allow for a greater congressional oversight of embassy construction and save taxpayers money. The State Department must balance designing a functional space that will properly represent the United States to the host country with the necessary security protections for the modern age. Protecting our diplomats overseas should be a top priority, which is why I was disappointed to see the Trump administration budget request a 28.4 decrease for fiscal year 2019 from 2018 enacted levels for embassy security and construction. We heard repeatedly that the tragedy that happened in Benghazi should not be repeated. This administration has to make embassy security a bigger priority. That's why I'm glad we're voting on this legislation to protect our diplomats working overseas and prevent projects from going over cost. I was also an original co-sponsor of HRES 256, expressing support for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, which is under consideration today. This important resolution calls for continued U.S. support for NATO allies and the European Deterrence Initiative. Putin's illegal annexation of Crimea and interference in European elections cannot be forgotten. Russia has undermined international law and killed tens of thousands of Ukrainians. This resolution shows Europe and NATO that the U.S. Congress stands by our allies and will not allow Russia to threaten our collective security. I yield back.
Thank you, Congresswoman Kelly. We go to Lee Zeldin of New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the committee's consideration of these bills today. Beginning with HCON Res 20, this resolution has been introduced since 2013 regarding the execution-style murders of Yili, 25 years old, Agron, 23 years old, and Mehmet, 21 years old, who were born in the United States and resided in the greatest congressional district in America, in the Hampton Bays, 1st Congressional District of New York. In July of 1999, these three brothers went overseas towards the end of the Kosovo War and were arrested by Serbian authorities for illegally entering the country when they accidentally crossed into Serbian-controlled territory. The brothers were kidnapped, murdered, and dumped into a mass grave in Serbia by government officials still serving today. Since taking office, I've been committed to helping the Bertucci family receive the justice they have long deserved. They're here today in the audience in support of today's resolution and to honor their family's sacrifice. It is absolutely reprehensible that despite many promises by Serbian officials to resolve the case of this state-sponsored murder, no individual has ever been found guilty of this horrible crime, nor of any other crimes associated with the deaths of these innocent Americans. It is the Serbian government's responsibility to resolve this case, and my resolution notes that progress with this investigation should remain a significant factor which determines the further development of U.S.-Serbian relations. The Bertucci brothers gave their lives to fight injustice. Now we must return this favor and deliver justice for their family. I want to thank the chair for his support in bringing this resolution. I'd like to thank the ranking member, Elliot Engel, for all of his advocacy through the years, all of my colleagues for supporting it. I'm also proud of the committee's consideration of H.R. 5898, the UNRWA Accountability Act, a robust bipartisan effort with Mr. Cicilline to maintain oversight over UNRWA's activities in the West Bank and Gaza. Over the past 6 years, every effort to obtain transparency over UNRWA has failed, with classified reports and uncertainty regarding who is actually responsible for conducting reviews. We need to crack down on UNRWA and ensure that we are not supporting a refugee agency that keeps millions in a permanent state of dependency. Our bill will provide important information to Congress regarding the definition of refugees served by UNRWA, as well as a strategy for burden sharing that offers the opportunity for other regional actors to contribute evenly. We must demand transparency over the anti-Israel textbooks in this program that is fueling another generation of hate. I've read the classified reports. I've spoken to our colleague, Scott Perry. There are other members who are very concerned about this, and there's more that we need to be doing in the weeks, months, and years ahead. The United States cannot support a program that goes against the best interests of our greatest ally. I would like to thank our committee chairman, Ed Royce, and ranking member Elliot Engel for their leadership and assistance on these important issues. I look forward to working with my colleagues in the House and our friends in the Senate to pass these bills. Again, I would like to thank you, Chairman, ranking member, for your hard work in support of these bills, and I yield back.
Mr. Zeldin, we go to Brendan Boyle of Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am supportive of each one of these 9 resolutions. I just want to highlight one, because I think that it's incredibly important at this time in history, and that is HRES 256, which expresses support for the countries of Eastern Europe and NATO. We have led now for 70 years through Democratic and Republican administrations the Western Alliance. NATO has been the bulwark against first Soviet and then Russian expansionism. This is something that all Americans should be very proud of. And now that some doubt has been raised about this country's commitment to NATO, I think that it is vital that this committee assert itself on a bipartisan basis to speak out with one voice that we support NATO, that we support our allies, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, as they continue to deal with Russian attacks, whether they're of physical force, like our friends in Ukraine are experiencing today, or they're in the cyber realm. So I am proud to support this. I applaud my fellow co-sponsors, both Democrats and Republicans, and with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Boyle, and we agree with your point. We go now to Mr. Mike McCall of Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding today's markup. I'm pleased to have Bill H.R. 4969, the Improving Embassy Design and Security Act, considered today. Mr. Chairman, in 1998, terrorists at the direction of Osama bin Laden bombed U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, killing over 220 people and injuring 4,000 more. This assault foreshadowed bin Laden's intention to attack America and demonstrated we need to seriously reassess our embassy security. That is why in 1999, Congress adopted a standard embassy design for our missions abroad. This design improves security, expedited construction, and saved money. For 20 years, this design template has been key in mitigating attacks. We've also saved taxpayer dollars through bypassing expensive architectural bids. However, recently, we have deviated from the standard embassy design in favor of projects prioritizing aesthetics. While I certainly appreciate the desire for our embassies to have a presentable facade, we must prevent a repeat of Kenya and Tanzania. To that end, my bill will require the State Department to provide Congress with justification should an embassy or consulate project not use a standard design. Embassies are the physical representation of the United States abroad. Providing security for our diplomats should be our #1 priority. I think, if anything, Benghazi certainly demonstrates that. So I believe my bill is a good step towards achieving that goal. And thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for moving these bills through the committee.
Thank you, Chairman McCall. We go to Norma Torres of California.
Thank you, Chairman Royce and Ranking Member Engel, for your hard work on these bipartisan bills. I support all of these measures, and I can't say enough about the work that you two do, the bipartisan work that both of you do together, and how this committee performs on an ongoing basis. In particular, I'm glad that we are considering H.R. 1697, the Israel Anti-Boycott Act. For too long, Israel has been unfairly singled out at the United Nations and elsewhere. No country is perfect. All of us can do better. But the criticism of Israel is simply not proportionate to its flaws. This bill is an important effort to address that problem. And I thank the chairman and the ranking member for their hard work to address some of the First Amendment concerns that have been raised. I also want to thank the chairman and ranking member for bringing up House Resolution 944, and I was thrilled to have the opportunity to work with Chairman Smith on this resolution, which expresses sympathy for the victims of the recent volcanic eruption in Guatemala. And I appreciate several members of this committee joining us as co-sponsors. We all care deeply about the beautiful country of Guatemala, and I'm encouraged that we can join together in support of the victims. According to the latest figures from the Guatemalan government, 112 people were killed by this volcano eruption. 12,923 have been evacuated, 197 missing, and 29 were injured. People across Guatemala and the international community have joined together in a relief effort. The U.S. government worked to transfer 6 children who were burn victims, the youngest only 1 year and 8 months old, to the Shriners Hospital in Galveston, Texas. USAID has announced $300,000 in initial funding for relief efforts, and I've read stories of volunteers from those communities that were mostly affected who have taken it upon themselves to search for victims or the bodies of their relatives and friends. Just the other day, I had the opportunity to sit down with Chef Jose Andres, who is doing tremendous work getting food to those who need it, especially the hardworking first responders that are saving many lives every day. We've seen countries across the region, Honduras, Mexico, and from across the entire world, strong allies like Israel and Taiwan send aid as well. It's encouraging to see so many people who are concerned about the victims, but we can't lose focus on this issue, and we must remain vigilant to ensure that the victims get the help they need and are able to reestablish their lives in Guatemala. Otherwise, we could see this volcanic eruption lead to yet another wave of refugees at our border. I urge all of the members here in Congress to help continue to encourage USAID to do all of that they can do to help these victims relocate within the Guatemalan border. So I again thank the chairman and the ranking member, and I urge my colleagues to support this important measure, and I yield back.
Thank you, Congresswoman Torres. Now we go to the author of the ROAR Act, and from the title, I presume, Wildlife Protection and Katy Perry fan, Dan Donovan of Staten Island.
I'll take half of that credit, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'm proud to sponsor the ROAR Act, Rescuing Animals with Rewards, H.R. 6197. The ROAR Act will help ensure that eliminating the terrorist and transnational criminal organizations engaged in wildlife trafficking and poaching will be a top rewards priority. Combating terrorism is of the utmost importance, not just to my constituents, not just to New Yorkers, but to the entire nation. It is an issue that reaches across the aisle. My district on Staten Island in South Brooklyn, which is home to many of New York City's bravest and finest, suffered hundreds of first responder casualties on September 11th of 2001. Since then, New York remains the world's top terror target. As a nation, we've become more resilient and determined to mitigate threats. But as we have choked off other sources of money, terrorists have increasingly turned to wildlife trafficking as a way to fund their heinous endeavors. Any step, no matter how incremental, we can take that will lead to the capture and conviction of anyone engaged in wildlife trafficking, especially terrorists, is a step in the right direction. I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your support on this bill, and I thank my friend from the other side of the aisle, Mr. Castro, for co-leading with me. I would also like to thank the staff at the Foreign Affairs Committee who have put much excellent work into this bill. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Well, and with that, we'll go to Mr. Castro.
Thank you, Chairman.
Texas.
Thank you, Representative Donovan, for your work and your partnership on that bill, and to the other members of the committee on their bills. I do want to raise a concern with H.R. 1697, which is that I basically think that the bill is written a bit too vague and it's too broad. It mentions that the President's going to come up with regulations to protect nations that are friendly to the United States, but doesn't go on to define exactly which nations those are. The reason that I think that it's problematic is because this administration, including the President, on any controversial issue of foreign policy, have essentially given us 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 different answers. Sometimes the President has given different answers himself on the same subject. So I hope that between now and the time that the bill goes on the floor, perhaps there can be some more definition. I would also feel more comfortable if Congress had some say over this, rather than essentially right now expanding the foreign policy power of this President, who I believe in many ways has been irresponsible with that power. I yield back.
Thank you. We go to Brad Schneider of Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, thank you for holding today's markup. I commend my colleagues for working on the legislation before us today. In particular, I appreciate the efforts of my good friend from Florida, Ted Yoho, on his bill, H.R. 5576, the Cyber Deterrence and Response Act of 2018. This bill will help protect our country from cyber attacks by requiring the President to designate foreign persons and entities responsible for state-sponsored cyber threats. This bill would also require the President to publish and regularly update this list, and finally, impose sanctions. We know there are malicious actors out there right now seeking to target the United States. Russia's efforts to interfere in our 2016 election was only the beginning, as we've heard from our intelligence community that serious threats remain. Earlier this year, the Director of National Intelligence stated that Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea will pose the greatest cyber threats to the United States during the next year. Our government must do more to protect our election infrastructure and seek to ensure the integrity of every citizen's vote. I would also like to express my appreciation for the work of my colleagues in updating H.R. 1697, the Israel Anti-Boycott Act. I am a co-sponsor of this bill that declares it is United States policy to oppose boycotts imposed by international government organizations against countries that are friends to the United States. This bill solely covers commercial activity and does nothing to limit the rights of individuals protected by the First Amendment. Finally, I would like to commend the work of my colleagues David Cicilline and Lee Zeldin for their work on H.R. 5898, the UNRWA Accountability Act, and to associate myself with the sentiment in the bill expressing the sense of Congress that the administration should complete its reviews of U.S. assistance programs for the West Bank and Gaza and UNRWA. This bill also calls for a long-term strategy for policy towards UNRWA and will help us better understand the reforms the administration has called for, how they plan to address the humanitarian needs currently covered by UNRWA, and the impact any policy changes will have on border regional security and stability, including specifically towards Israel. Once again, I thank the Chairman and Ranking Member for holding today's hearing, and with that, I yield back.
We go now to David Cicilline of Rhode Island.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you and the Ranking Member for holding this markup and for including the UNRWA Accountability Act, which I introduced with my colleague, Mr. Zeldin, on the list of bills being considered today. Holding a markup on this bill is a testament to the bipartisanship of this committee and the leadership of Chairman Royce and Ranking Member Engel. As we all know, UNRWA can be a controversial topic here in Congress, but we've been able to come together to support a bill that will reassert congressional oversight for funding programs to UNRWA and the West Bank and Gaza. In January, the Trump administration announced that it was holding any further funding for UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees, which is the UN agency responsible for carrying out assistance programs for Palestinian refugees. Today, there are roughly 5 million Palestinians eligible for UNRWA services in the West Bank, Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. We've also been recently informed by the administration officials that all future assistance for the West Bank and Gaza has been put on hold pending review as well. This legislation will assert proper congressional oversight of the administration's review of funds to UNRWA and assistance to the West Bank and Gaza, and ensure that details of the review process are provided in a timely manner in what so far has been a review with no discernible process or timeline. It will do this by requiring that the administration submit 2 reports to Congress detailing the status of the reviews within 45 days. To be clear, I believe that funding for these bilateral programs and for UNRWA, funding which has been appropriated by Congress, should be resumed immediately. There is no reason why it's necessary to hold funding while conducting the review, and any decisions made as a result of the review can be carried out in the new fiscal year with appropriate coordination with Congress. Congress has repeatedly sought details about the ongoing reviews from administration officials, but very little has been provided. Meanwhile, the situation of Palestinian refugees, particularly in Gaza, is getting more dire by the day. For example, UNRWA has said that it currently faces a $250 million shortfall for 2018, and despite taking measures to limit expenditures, will be unable to open all of its 700 schools on time in August. Hamas has offered to take over administration of Palestinian schools in Gaza should UNRWA be unable to do so. UNRWA doesn't have funding to support food rations for the final quarter of the year, which will leave hundreds of thousands of Palestinians without the ability to meet their nutritional needs. The unemployment rate in Gaza is nearly 50%. And UNRWA is about to terminate 3,000 short-term contracts due to budget shortfalls, leaving even more families without the means to support themselves. The freeze of bilateral assistance programs in the West Bank and Gaza, which are largely carried out by NGOs, is also having a devastating impact. For example, Catholic Relief Services has said that 140,000 individuals in Gaza will lose emergency assistance and they will be forced to lay off 90 staff members by September. American Near East Refugee Aid reports that if the freeze continues, 71,000 people will lose access to projects improving water, sanitation, schools, and other critical facilities. These are just a few examples of the real-world impact that the current freeze of funds is having on Palestinians. I asked the chairman for unanimous consent to place 2 documents into the record. The first is a program budget and Gaza field update provided by UNRWA, and the second is a compilation of information from NGOs working in Gaza and the West Bank titled NGO Programs in Gaza and the West Bank, Impact by Funding Hold During Administrative Review as of June 15, 2000.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Whatever criticisms we have of UNRWA and the Palestinian leadership, and there are many valid ones, it is contrary to American interests and the interests of Israel to exacerbate this humanitarian crisis. If the administration is seeking structural changes to UNRWA, they must seek them at the United Nations General Assembly, which is the only body that can alter UNRWA's mandate. If they want to seek alternatives to UNRWA for American assistance delivery, they should do so in a concerted and transparent way that does not leave a devastating funding gap for Palestinian humanitarian assistance. And if they desire reforms that UNRWA can undertake internally, they should submit those reforms to UNRWA and begin a conversation about how they can be achieved. I would note that there is a formal process for this, and the Trump administration signed a new framework for cooperation between the United States and UNRWA in December of 2017, which lays out a series of shared goals and priorities for UNRWA and the United States. I'd like to submit this document into the record and ask unanimous consent to do so.
Without objection.
Rather than take a series of thoughtful and coordinated steps in order to lay out and address their concerns with UNRWA, the administration has acted in a way that suggests to me that they intend to use the increasingly dire humanitarian situation in Gaza and the West Bank as a stick to try to force Palestinian acquiescence to a Jared Kushner peace plan. This is not only cruel, it's bad policy. As the United States slows or stops its contributions to UNRWA, we must understand that other actors will fill the gap. Countries like Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Qatar will not ask for strict oversight of UNRWA school curriculum or the abuse of UNRWA resources by Hamas. If we give up our position as a donor, we also give up our influence. This is a dangerous game. If you don't believe me, believe the current Chief of Staff of the Israeli Defense Forces, Gadi Eisenkot, who said in an interview earlier this year that the likelihood of escalation to the point of war has increased substantially between Gaza and Israel, in part because of the cuts to UNRWA funding. And I'd like to ask unanimous consent to place that article in the record as well. And Mr. Chairman, just in closing, I know many of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle have deep concerns about the functions of UNRWA, about Hamas's role in Gaza, and about the Palestinian leadership's commitment to achieving peace. I share many of these concerns, and I think this body has taken many steps to address these issues. But we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I'm glad that today we are able to consider a bipartisan piece of legislation that will bring some order and timeliness to this review process and exert proper congressional oversight of our foreign assistance. I want to thank all my colleagues for their support of this legislation, and particularly thank Mr. Zeldin for working across the aisle to ensure this issue receives due consideration by this body. And I thank the chairman for his indulgence and yield back.
Thank you. We go to Ted Poe, Texas.
Thank you, Chairman. I support all of these pieces of legislation before us, except the last one from Mr. Zeldin. And I have some questions. He's not here, but maybe Mr. Engel can yield for a question or two regarding H-Con Res 20.
Sorry, certainly.
It's my understanding that there have been some prosecutions. Those people were tried, they were found not guilty and upheld on appeal. Is that right or wrong?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't know of any.
All right. According to the, anyway, I believe that has occurred. I'll take back my time. My concern, Mr. Chairman, is the fact that we, in this H-Con Res, and I'll make it very clear, being a former judge, criminals need to be prosecuted, and prosecuted wherever they commit these crimes in the world. I do believe that Serbia is moving to try to find at least the one person that has been mentioned in the resolution itself and prosecute. But be that as it may, I don't think that the answer to getting Serbia to prosecute these outlaws is to not have relationship with the country of Serbia. I think we can only solve these problems if we have a relationship with countries, not if we break off relationships with these countries. So that's for that reason I would not support this H-Con Res.
Would the gentleman yield?
Absolutely.
I thank the judge for yielding. I would point out that in this particular case, although charges were brought at one point yes, charges were brought momentarily against 2 individuals, but swiftly those charges were then again dropped. There was another case, as you say, where charges were brought on a 3rd individual, but that individual passed on. So it became a moot point. The point I would make is that we can engage, we can have a relationship with states, but at the same time retain our rights on behalf of our own citizens. So in this particular circumstance, we have 3 American citizens hiking on the border who cross over the border from Albania to Serbia and then are killed by a death squad. It is, I think, under this set of circumstances, the fact that no one's been brought yet to the bar of justice, these many years after, altogether appropriate upon reflection here, I think, given that set of circumstances, that we move a resolution. And remember that as this resolution was written, we did try to incorporate this particular perspective, Your Honor. Judge, we did recognize recent improvements in U.S.-Serbia relations in the text in order to try to be balanced. We added, whereas in the following years, the political leadership of Serbia has worked to strengthen democratic institutions. I think that's an important point. Strengthen democratic institutions, to develop stronger adherence to the rule of law, and to ensure respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms, including as the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia evolved into a state union of Serbia and Montenegro in February of '03, which is self-dissolved. Okay, so the point is that we've included that language, but at the end of the day, we're left with 3 Americans whose lives were taken by a paramilitary unit and nothing done by the state to hold someone ultimately accountable. For that, I think it's quite understandable and quite proper that we move forward and speak on behalf of those Americans. I yield back.
Reclaiming my time. Once again, where crimes are committed, wherever they happen in the world, especially against Americans, we ought to go get the outlaws. We ought to have that country help get the outlaws. But just reading the resolution as it's written, it states that there were 2 individuals that were tried and found not guilty, and they appealed their case, and the appellate court upheld the acquittal on those 2 individuals. But my concern is not that. My concern is how we as a nation go after encouraging Serbia to correct this mistake, correct this crime, rather, and make sure people are brought to justice. And I'm concerned about how our diplomatic relations should not decrease, they should increase. So that's the concern I have, is the way that it's addressed in the resolution, how we find justice for these 3 individuals. That certainly the criminals need to be brought to justice. So I will yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Engel.
I'm wondering if I can get some time to comment on this.
Mr. Engel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When Secretary Tillerson was still Secretary of State and came before this committee, I just want to read into the record an exchange that I had with him. I said that I'm deeply concerned with the lack of justice for murders and crimes committed by the government of Serbia during and after the Kosovo War. In particular, there have been no charges brought against anyone for the murders of 3 American citizens, the Batici brothers, despite widespread understanding of who was behind them. Serbian President Vučić and Acting Prime Minister Dačić has promised very senior U.S. government officials for many years that they would bring to justice the perpetrators of his crime and the crime of burning our embassy in 2008. They both also made these promises to me. On January 31st of this year, the respected Humanitarian Law Center of Belgrade released a dossier called The Cover-Up of Evidence of Crimes During the War in Kosovo, the Concealment of Bodies Operation. This report described mass graves in Serbia containing the bodies of 941 Kosovo Albanians mainly civilians killed outside combat situations in Kosovo during 1999. According to the report, and I quote, "The evidence corroborated that the decision to conceal evidence of crimes committed was planned as early as March 1999 at the highest level of the government and indicated that members of both departments of the Serbian MUP, which is the State Security Department, Public Security Department, and the Yugoslav's Army departments in charge of clearing up the terrain," that's a quote, "were involved in it. The murder and mass burial of almost 1,000 innocent civilians is a crime against humanity, but the perpetrators have gone unpunished. It's long past time for Belgrade to face these facts and bring to justice the people, including high officials in its government, who are behind these very serious crimes. At the same time, the Serbian stalling and stonewalling has brought no adjustment in policy from the United States and the European Union's willingness to proceed with Serbia's accession process to the EU has been unaffected. This has to stop. It has to stop now until Serbia brings those who have committed these serious crimes to justice. The EU should not move ahead with Belgrade's accession process, and the United States should think twice before advancing our relations with Serbia." And I asked, what is the United States doing to press Serbia to bring to justice the murderers of the Petici brothers, those who burned the United States Embassy, and those who murdered and buried in mass graves almost 1,000 innocent Kosovo civilians, with the ICTY, which is ICTY, no longer accepting any new cases and closing down at the end of this year, and Serbia seemingly unwilling to prosecute anyone for these grave offenses? Will you support a new international or special tribunal similar to that which was established in Kosovo to prosecute those responsible? And Secretary Tillerson answered, "We share your frustration with the lack of progress in the Petici case and the slow progress in the 2008 embassy burning case, and raise the issue with Serbian officials at all levels of government, including with Serbian President Aleksandar Vučić. We have also informed Serbian officials that these issues stand in the way of closer bilateral relations. Serbia recently appointed a new special war crimes prosecutor. The position had remained vacant for almost a year and a half, and we have called for the Petici case to be a priority in her work. We are hopeful that this appointment will serve to advance the investigation and prosecution of those responsible for the Petici murders." And I think I'll end here. And,
Will the gentleman yield?
Certainly.
I don't quarrel with anything that you have said regarding what has happened in the war crimes and the incidents throughout history. My concern is if we diminish our relationship with Serbia, getting an answer to that, all of these questions that you have brought up, I don't think will increase. I think it's a mistake to decrease relations with Serbia. I think we need to increase those relations so that we can get resolution to all of the things that you have mentioned. So I will yield back to the gentleman. I thank him for his comments.
Let me just say very quickly to the gentleman who's my friend and who I have a lot of respect for. The frustration is that it's been 19 years, you know, and nothing seems to happen, whether we have good relations or bad relations or anything like that. And so it's very frustrating. I had an ironclad promise face-to-face by the head of Serbia, Mr. Vučić, who told me it would take him a month, and it's been much more than a year now. So it's just a frustration. I know the gentleman has worked very hard in trying to improve relations in that part of the world and improve relations with countries and the United States, but it's just coming to a head, and it's very, very frustrating. But I understand the gentleman's points.
Noting we're halfway into the vote on the floor, we must go to Mr. Jerry Connolly of Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And knowing that, let me just say I want to associate myself with the remarks of Mr. Cicilline. A humanitarian crisis by defunding or freezing funding for UNRWA is not going to add anything in terms of stability in the Middle East, and it's not a friendly act to Israel. So I certainly associate myself with him and support H.R. 5898. I just wanted to thank the chairman and ranking member and the author of the bill, H.R. 5576, for accepting my amendment, which is adding Russia as an identified cyber bully. Nobody has interfered historically in American elections with the breadth and scope of Russia, we need to take cognizance of that. The Trump Treasury Department did just that in announcing sanctions in March against 5 Russian entities and 19 Russian individuals pursuant to Executive Order 13694 and the overwhelmingly passed bipartisan bill Countering America Adversaries Through Sanctions Act. So I thank my colleagues for accepting the amendment. I think it's an important statement for us, and I intend to support the motions before us.
And we thank you for your contribution to the bill with that amendment, Mr. Connolly.
I thank you, and I yield back.
Hearing no further requests for recognition, the question occurs on items considered en bloc. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the measures considered en bloc are agreed to. Without objection, each measure in the en bloc is ordered favorably reported as amended, as a single amendment in the nature of a substitute, and staff is directed to make any technical and conforming changes, and the chair is authorized to seek House consideration under suspension of the rules. That concludes our business today, and I want to thank, of course, all our members here and Ranking Member Engel for your contributions and assistance with today's markup. The committee is adjourned.